seems like a lifetime ago, America was really working on trying to stay isolated. Through the 1920s, that's what we wanted. We wanted to be isolated from the rest of the world, go back to that idea of Washington where we stay out of foreign entanglements. And that's exactly where we are at this point going into the 1930s. Three examples of isolationism that you're going to see that the America practiced during this time. The first one we've talked about before, and that's the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The purpose behind this was it was trying to basically outlaw war, make war illegal throughout the entire world. And we saw 62 countries sign on to this. But I also pointed out to you that this was an absolute paper tiger. There was no way you could enforce it. And if you look at the cartoon that I have there on the slide, you can see that, you know, all sorts of stuff is going to start happening in the world in 36, 37, 38, and finally in 39, all of it's just going to blow up in our face. And 1939 marks the year that World War II is going to start. But that was just one example of what we used. Another one is going to be the Simpson Doctrine. Now, in 1931, Japan is looking to expand their empire. And for several reasons. Number one, I think the first and foremost, they wanted to get more natural resources. As they are an island, they don't have access to any other resources than what's already there. So they're going to start expanding into the Asian continent, looking for natural resources, one of the biggest ones being oil. And they're going to start by invading Manchuria. Now, as a response to Japanese aggressive behavior, the United States is going to pass the Simpson Doctrine. And what the Simpson Doctrine says is this: the United States government will not recognize any foreign government that has been put in place by an aggressive action. Meaning, if Japan puts their own government into Manchuria, we're not going to recognize it because that's superseding the Manchurian government. And so we just can't recognize that aggressive behavior. Well, when this is passed, Japan basically started laughing because it was a joke to them. They didn't take this seriously at all, and nor should they, because there was no enforcement behind it. It was just, we're not going to recognize you. Not going to do anything about it, but we're also just not going to recognize you. And then the third and final act towards isolationism is going to be the passage of the Neutrality Acts. And the Neutrality Acts are going to be put in place to prevent America from getting involved in another war. And I'll explain here in just a minute why we thought that these acts would do that. But I want to point out on the right, the cartoon there that you see of Get Your Ostrich Bonnet Here. This was created by none other than Dr. Seuss. I know most of us know Dr. Seuss from The Grinch and from, you know, Green Eggs and Ham and all the other stuff that he created that we love. But where he really got a lot of fame was through his political cartoons during World War II. This one you can see basically he's, you know, egging America on, saying you're ignoring what's going on. And, you know, with the ostrich sticks his head underneath the sand so it can't see what's going on around it. And so what Dr. Seuss is saying is basically these neutrality acts are like putting on an ostrich bonnet. We're ignoring what's really going on in order just to, you know, pretend like we don't see it, okay? So that's what was going on. All right, so we get the neutrality acts. The big idea behind these is that we want to make sure we don't get any weapons to belligerents. There's going to be 3 sets of neutrality acts, 1936, 37, and 39. And I'm going to talk about each one of these specifically, but I also want to talk about why these acts were put in place. In the 1920s and 30s, Americans were really pushing to stay out of another war. They looked back at World War I and said, you know, like I said earlier, it was meaningless. What did we actually gain from that war? And so they put together in Congress what's known as the Nye Committee. It was led by Gerald Nye. I think he was from Idaho or Montana, someplace like that. And they investigated what led the United States into going into World War I. And simply they said it was the fault of the munition makers, so all these factories that were making weapons, and bankers who were given loans to all the foreign countries. It was their fault that we got pulled into this war. And they labeled them the merchants of death. And when this committee came out with their findings, you started to see this growing swell of pacifism in our country, not just isolating ourselves from the rest of the world, but actually taking a passive stance towards any type of war. And you start to see these protests on college campuses, such as sit-ins and walkouts and everything. And I think it's kind of funny because we tend to tie college protests against war to the 1960s, but it really got its start here in the 1930s, leading up to World War II. Excuse me. Also during this time, Walter Mill is going to write a book, and this book is titled America's Road to War. And not only does he buy into what the Nye Committee is saying, he basically says that, you know, it was Wilson's fault that we went to war, and it was the Britain's fault that we went to war, because Britain was putting out all this, you know, wartime propaganda that Americans were buying into, and Wilson was letting them do it. And so they duped us. They basically tricked us into joining the war. And so this is just adding more and more fuel to the fire of, staying out of any foreign entanglements. Because America's like, let's go back to that whole idea of fish are our friends. We got these two oceans. No one's going to bother us over here. So this Nye Committee is going to lead to the passage of the Neutrality Acts. And I'm going to go over each one of these separately. But what they basically did is they took the findings of the Nye Committee, they tied it to the steps that led us to entering into the war, and they said if we just eliminate those steps, we'll stay out of any future wars that might come up. So let's look at a couple of these. The first one, Neutrality Act of 1935. What this did, it banned all arms sales or weapons sales to any countries at war. So basically, if you were at war, excuse me, it's not the virus, I promise. If you are at war right now, we're not going to sell you any weapons. And also, there was a warning tagged on to this Neutrality Act saying that Americans should not sail on any ships of countries that are at war at this point. And so you can look back into the 19-teens when that's exactly what we were doing. We were selling weapons to both sides, both the Central Powers and the Triple Entente. We were also loaning money to both sides. And, if you think back to the Lusitania, we were sailing on ships from belligerent countries. So, the thought is, let's just get rid of all that, and we're not going to run into the same problems. That leads us to the Neutrality Act of 1936. There's the loans that are going to be banned. It just ties right back to the 35 one, that we're not going to loan any money to any countries at war. They're on their own financially. We're not going to get caught up in that, and then we don't have to, fall back into a Dawes plan and trying to get our money back and stuff like that. Finally, the Neutrality Act, it's 1937. I think I had 39 on the other screen, but there is a 39 that I'll get to, so I apologize for that. But the Neutrality Act of 37 made 35 and 36 permanent, which basically they just restated them, prioritized those two ideas. And then they also tied a cash and carry basis to all trade coming in or going out of the United States. So basically what cash and carry means is if you want to buy any American-made good except for war munitions, you are more than welcome to send your ships over to our ports, give us cash, we'll sell you what you need, you can put it on your ship and then transport it back to your country. That's going to avoid the problem that we had with our ships, being shot at by the German subs and stuff like that, thinking there might be war goods on there. So we're not even going to send our ships to you. You have to come and get it. So those are the Neutrality Acts. The Neutrality Acts are going to keep the United States out of war for a while, but it's not going to prevent a war from happening. So now what I want to do is take you through the timeline of events that actually lead to World War II and lead to the United States entering into the war. And it all starts with that invasion of Manchuria that I talked about earlier. 1931, Japan is going to invade Manchuria, and this is going to be in violation of the League of Nations. And if you look at the cartoon on the right, it basically shows you exactly what Japan thought of all the different treaties and agreements they signed, leading up to this. They were after what they were after. And as far as they were concerned, all that stuff that you see there on the right, from the Nine Power Treaty to the League of Covenant to the Shanghai Port Treaty, all of that is worthless. It's just not even worth the paper it's written on. And so it shows Japan firing their weapons through that, and those weapons are going to be used to take down Manchuria. The picture on the left is the quintessential image of the Manchurian incident. We don't know, I don't know exactly where this picture originated, but I think it shows the devastation around this toddler who was sitting along the railroad tracks, just covered in dirt and mud and everything. Pause here for a second, because I want you to consider something. Go back to World War I and think about how we got involved, or how that war got started. And it all started with the Serbians assassinating the Archduke of the Austria-Hungarian Empire. And then Germany gets involved. By the end of World War I, Germany is blamed for the entire war, although they weren't the ones that started it. In a sense, if you look at this moment in time in 1931, Japan is the first country to take some form of aggressive behavior towards another country to expand their empire. And you could very easily make the argument that Japan is starting the road to World War II, that they're making the first move. But we also know that while Japan will be, take some of the blame, Germany is going to take on a lot of the blame for World War II. But just a little comparison there for you. January 1933, Hitler is going to be appointed Chancellor of Germany. The title Chancellor basically gives him the power over the German military, and he is going to start rebuilding that military. He is going to ignore the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to start rebuilding the Air Force, rebuilding the Navy, and bringing more troops in. This is actually going to help Germany get out of the Great Depression, is through their wartime production. I also include the picture of the left of Hitler as a child, just to show you that sometimes hair just doesn't get better no matter how old you get. So the one guy I want to point out there is the guy at the bottom. That's Heinrich Himmler. He was the Reichsführer of the Schutzstaffel. And basically he was Hitler's right-hand man. And you should know Himmler's name because this is the man who devised the plan that would become known as the Holocaust. He is the man who took what, I guess, Hitler's vision of the final solution and put it into action. So I always like to point him out in this picture here. October 1935, another fascist dictator is going to rise to power, and that's going to be Benito Mussolini. And the first thing he's going to do to expand his empire is invade Africa, and he's going to go into Ethiopia. Now, the Italians are going to, catch them off guard, and they're also not only going to take Ethiopia, but they will move throughout North Africa. And though this is not a military course, a military history course, it is important to know that it was through North Africa that America is going to enter into World War II. They're not going to initially attack in Europe. They're going to start in Africa, and then once they take that, they'll move up through Italy. But it's Benito Mussolini who controls the Axis powers in Africa. 1936, March, we're moving closer and closer to the start of the war. Hitler, once again, wanting to undo the Treaty of Versailles, is going to take his military and remilitarize the Rhineland. Remember, the Rhineland is that western section of Germany that's set between the German capital and Belgium and France. And the idea was to demilitarize it would allow that to become like a buffer zone, because that was typically from the region that Germany would attack. Obviously, they're coming through the Rhineland to get to Belgium, to get to France. So by creating this buffer zone, that would help protect those two countries. March of that same year, Germany and Italy are going to join forces. They're going to form the Axis powers. Japan will join in 1940, and those three countries will be the predominant countries within the Axis powers. Allied powers haven't formed up yet because we're not technically at war yet. So, but Mussolini and Hitler make their agreement and they become buddies. 1937, not to forget what's going on in the the Asian region. Japan is going to invade Nanjing. Nanjing is considered the southern capital of China. And when the Japanese soldiers went through Nanjing, they literally went on a raping and pillaging uh, movement. And that's exactly what they did. And that's why it's also referred to as the Rape of Nanjing. By the time it was all over, more than 300,000 victims, not just military, but civilian victims as well, fell to the Japanese troops going through Nanjing. All of this is just to expand their empire. They weren't satisfied in Manchuria. Now they're moving into China. Again, the League of Nations is addressing all this stuff. They addressed the remilitarization of the Rhineland. They addressed, the Japanese moving into Manchuria and then moving down into China, into Nanjing. But the problem is with the League of Nations, it was very weak. Without the United States in there, there was really no one powerful enough or politically strong enough to stop these actions. So basically just picture the League of Nations giving a slap on the wrist to Japan when they invade China, or Germany when they militarize, or Italy when they go into to Africa. They're just giving them a slap on the hand saying, oh, bad dictators, you're not supposed to do that. But they're not taking any action to stop them. So that gives them, the more you let them get away with, the more they're going to try to take. Now, Germany doesn't want to just expand into the Rhineland. Germany wants to expand beyond their current borders. Now, what Hitler is going to argue is that what he wants to do is reunite all the German-speaking people of Europe. If you remember correctly, after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, new borders were built, new countries were created. Some countries disappeared. And in doing so, you had a lot of Germans who were displaced. All of a sudden, they found themselves as citizens of other countries. So when he started to expand, Hitler used the idea that I'm bringing back the regular, the true German-speaking people. I'm bringing them all back to their homeland, and that's all I really want to do. The first place he's going to go is Austria. Now, Austria was actually Hitler's birthplace, so he is Austrian, and Austria is going to be annexed back into Germany. I think it's going to be annexed without a shot being fired. For those of you who are familiar, it was, The Sound of Music was based in Austria. And you probably remember, when, Maria and the captain come back from their honeymoon and there's a, Nazi flag hanging and he goes and rips it down and all this other stuff. Well, that's what's going on in the movie. It's Austria has just been re-annexed back into Germany. So that was step one. And again, League of Nations calls Hitler out on it. And he goes, no, I'm just reorganizing. I'm just bringing the German people back in. And the Austrians, they were part of the German Empire. So it's just natural they want to come back to us. And that was probably okay as far as the League of Nations. I'm like, well, we can make sense of that. When it gets a little funny, though, is when Germany tries to go farther. And that's when they try to go into what's known as the Sudetenland. You can see on here, Austria, you can see them on the map. But what I want to point out here, and this is where I messed up last time, so we'll try not to, is this area right here. This kind of this C-shaped area. This is actually part of Czechoslovakia. It's the western border of Czechoslovakia. And it's referred to as the Sudetenland. And Hitler is going to start moving his troops into that territory. And the argument is going to be that there are nearly 3 million German speaking people in the Sudetenland. So that's how he justifies his military action. Now, the world is starting to see what Hitler is doing, and they're starting to question, really what his intentions are. So Great Britain is going to send their prime minister, that's Neville Chamberlain, that's him standing to the left of Hitler, and they are going to discuss what's known as the Munich Agreement. And what's going to happen is Chamberlain is going to challenge Hitler and said, first it was Austria, but now you're moving into another country. You can almost make the Austrian argument because there were so many German speakers there and they were part of the German Empire. But now you're extending that, and we're not comfortable with that. And Hitler's like, really, seriously, All I want to bring is the German-speaking people back. So you give me the Sudetenland, and I promise you that will be the end of it. That's all I really want. You can trust me. And Chamberlain trusted him. And Chamberlain is going to sign the Munich Agreement. And in the speech that he gives justifying this agreement, he said, this is peace for our time. We don't do things the way we did 20 years ago when we had the Great War, the war to end all wars. Now we try to work for peace. We don't try to, work for war. So he goes, that's what we've done here with this agreement. Now, there were a lot of people who disagreed with that, one of those being Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was part of the government. He's not, prime minister yet, but he's going to challenge Chamberlain in public. And he's going to say basically that our democracy has been weighed in the balance and we've been found wanting, meaning we blew it. And he's like, not only that, he goes, this is not the end, like Chamberlain is saying. He goes, this is just the beginning. It's like, the idea of you give this guy an inch, he's going to take a mile. You give this guy, give Hitler the Sudetenland, he's going to want to take a lot more. And so that was Churchill's projection right after the Munich Agreement is signed. But regardless of some of the outcry of people against this, it is signed, and Germany will be given the Sudetenland through the Munich Pact, which I just find fascinating because you have these two major countries, not debating, but negotiating over this land that belongs to a third country. And I'll be honest, I'm not sure about the Czech president. I don't know if their president was there. I think his president was Václav Havel, if I remember correctly, but you don't need to know that. But you can see the brown territory right here. This is what's going to be given to Germany. And Neville Chamberlain, there he is as he's given the Peace for Our Time speech. And he is convinced that what they're doing is actually moving towards peace. In truth, what he's doing is what we call appeasement. And appeasement is when you give someone something just to avoid conflict. It's kind of like, you just say yes to somebody so they'll stop arguing with you. And what we've done with appeasement here is we've given Hitler the Sudetenland just to avoid conflict in the future. We think if we just give him this land, he's not going to want any more. He'll be happy and we can all go back to our nice, peaceful coexistence. Wrong. Absolutely wrong, because in March of 1939, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. And this pretty much is the start of World War I. You're going to see England and France, they will declare war on Germany, but this time Germany doesn't care because they're getting everything they want. And on top of that, Germany also has an ace in the hole, kind of an ace up their sleeve. And that ace is Joseph Stalin. August of 1939, Hitler is going to negotiate what's known as the Non-Aggression Pact, also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And what this pact was an agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany that the Soviet Union would stay neutral if war was to start. And the only reason they're going to stay neutral is because Hitler has told Stalin, for your cooperation with us, for your willingness to work with us, we're going to give you half of Poland. So all of this right here is going to go to the Soviet Union because Hitler plans on invading the rest of Poland and keeping that for himself. So what he's doing is he's promising, Stalin more land for his country, more land for his empire, and exchange what he's getting from Stalin is the promise that they're not going to get involved in this war. Okay, so that's the Non-Aggression Pact, and basically it does exactly what it says. It keeps, let me try to close this, keeps Russia out of the war, and Germany, once they get that in their hand, September 1st, 1939, they attack Poland, and they're going to use their Air Force, they're going to use their tanks, everything they can, and they're going to just rush into Poland and take it. And the Soviet Union is going to do the same from the eastern side. And so what you're going to see is you see the German movements coming in from the west, the Soviet Union's coming in from the east, and Poland disappears. Poland ceases to exist. It was a very easy take for these two countries because they used what was called Blitzkrieg or lightning war. One of the main tools that the Germans used is this new Panzer tank that is very speedy. It's faster than the tanks that we saw in World War I. It can cover a lot of ground quickly, and it can do a lot of damage with its cannons. And so that's what's going to happen. Once Poland falls, now Germany can focus on the Western Front because they have nothing to worry about in the East, because Stalin is just going to stay over on his side of the world and let Hitler do whatever he wants. This is going to lead to the invasion of France. 1940, after Poland has fallen, Hitler moves his troops to the Western Front. They are going to invade France through the Rhineland, and within 3 months, France will fall into control of Germany. Their government is going to be in exile. They're going to be working out of Great Britain, and as soon as France falls, Hitler and his leader and his leading generals are going to head into Paris, and they're going to take this iconic photograph, and that's going to go out in the press. And I always kind of say that this photograph represents Hitler's coming out party, where he's coming out to the rest of the world and the world leaders saying, I can do whatever I want. I took Poland, I've taken France, I'm gonna, Europe is mine for the taking, and nobody can stop me. It's a show of power is what he's doing with this picture. I mean, he takes the picture and then he goes back to Germany. So I don't even know if he stopped for a glass of wine, but that's going to lead to Great Britain, his next target, because he knows that Britain is probably the strongest military left that can take him down. And so the Battle of Britain is going to be one of the first major air attacks in modern history. We had planes in World War I, there was some dogfighting, but these planes have evolved now. And so it's just a major Air Force attack on Great Britain. I do believe that the German Navy also, bombarded the British shores as well. But it was a long-lasting attack trying to bring Great Britain to their knees. And the British lived in turmoil for months because these bombing raids would come at all hours of the day, and the sirens would go off, and the Britons had to go to different bomb shelters throughout their towns and cities. And the one thing I want to point out here is the eyes of war, or the tide of war, is changing, because it used to be that when you attack, you were just focused mostly on military targets. But in the Battle of Britain, it's cities and civilians who are being attacked as well. And so when these air raids came in, it was very unnerving when those sirens would come off. And but Britain held firm. Give her due. I mean, this is when that propaganda poster came out: "Keep calm and carry on." I'm sure you've seen. I think I got one in my classroom. But that's what they put these posters all over Great Britain, just to reassure the people, to remind them we got to stay calm, but we got to keep moving forward, and we will overcome this. And it's during this time that Winston Churchill is going to become the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he also is that voice of reason and voice of calm for the nation. But Great Britain needs help. I mean, honestly. And they start looking to the United States saying, can you come in and help us? Because if you look at the situation at this point, basically you have the Axis powers are formed: Germany, Japan, and Italy. But on the Allied side, you have Great Britain. I mean, France is useless. They're gone. And then, the Soviet Union is supposedly neutral. The United States is neutral. And Great Britain is looking for help. I mean, they probably went to the Soviet Union and they said no, because of the non-aggression pact, which honestly, I didn't mention this, but was a secret agreement between Hitler and Stalin. It wasn't something that they put out there or they advertised. And then when they come to the United States saying, hey, we need help, FDR's hands are tied by those Neutrality Acts. So he's got to figure out what to do. And when, you ask the American people, what should we do? They're kind of like, what? Fish are our friends. And if you remember, World War I really sucked for us. A lot of people died. And, the Spanish flu just took over and killed even more people and all this other stuff. We just want to stay here and be left alone. But FDR is recognizing that, that can't really be our state of mind. We've got to do more. And so he's going to go to the American people, and he pleads with them, saying that we must become this great arsenal to save democracy in the world. He's kind of tying back to what Woodrow Wilson said, that we went to protect or make the world safe for democracy. Now we got to save democracy. We did the first, now we got to do the second. Now he's not saying we have to go to war yet, but he's saying we need to make some conditional decisions, on how we can help our allies. And that's where this arsenal of democracy is going to be put together. And there's 3 parts to this arsenal. You have another cash and carry law from 1939. You have the Destroyers for Bases agreement between us and Great Britain. And finally, you have the Lendlease Act of 1941. Now, I'm going to talk about each one of these. So, don't worry if you didn't get them all 3 written down, because I'm going to circle back around to all 3. Let's first talk about the cash and carry. Same thing that we had before, except now we're going to basically limit who we trade with. We're just going to trade with Great Britain and the Allies now. We're not going to trade with the Axis powers. So Great Britain has the authority to come over and use us for cash and carry, but not for weapons. We're still not ready to give out weapons. No bullets, no planes, no guns, nothing. So that's 1939. The next one is going to be Destroyers for Bases. This is 1940. And in 1940, our government said, you know what, we made that law where we can't sell weapons to, foreign powers at war. There's nothing in there about trading. And so what we did is we traded U.S. naval destroyers, like you see in the picture right there, and we traded them for naval bases in the Caribbean that were once held by Great Britain. So they're going to give us access and control of those naval bases, and we're going to give them ships. So that's going to help out their Navy. But it's still not enough. FDR says we still need to get them wartime supplies. We still need to help them fight this battle. And we should be able to send them everything they need except men. And that's what he's trying to do. And that's where the Lend-Lease Act is going to come into play. This is 1941. And the Lend-Lease basically said, we can't sell you any wartime goods or any munitions, but we can lend them to you. We can lend you our planes, and we can lend you our tanks and our jeeps and our, machine guns and our bullets and everything. You just got to pay us back later after the war. Just bring them back when you're done with them. The lease part of it is we're going to let you rent it from us. So we're still not selling. We're still, living up to the Neutrality Act of 36. But we're circumventing it. We're basically going around it any way we can in order to support our ally in Great Britain. The other thing we're going to do, the other thing that FDR is going to do, is he's going to reinstitute the draft. Now, we had the draft in World War I, but after the war ended, we cut it back, and we cut back our military too. FDR is going to see the need to start building up our military. Again, he's not planning to go to war, but he's planning to go to war if he has to. He passed the Selective Service Act of 1940. This will be the first peacetime draft in our history. And we'll have the draft stay in place throughout the 1950s and 60s, and I think a little bit into the 70s as well. This had 2 major effects in America. The first effect is going to be the fact that we're rebuilding our military. He is going to draft 1 million men into the military, and he's going to ready these men to go fight in the war. And in doing so, we're going to need our own equipment here to train with and stuff like that. So you're going to see some factories, not a lot, but a few factories reopen, because we're still in the Great Depression. So just keep that in mind. You're going to see some factories reopening to focus on wartime production. Kind of similar to what you're seeing going on today. I don't know if I don't know how you can avoid the news, but we have the same thing going on today, where they signed the Defense Act yesterday. So different companies in the nation can start changing their production from consumer goods to goods that are going to help us fight this virus, whether it's ventilators or masks or whatever. So that's what is going on here in 1940. You're seeing factories start to turn towards wartime production. And so the one effect is it's going to build up our military. And when we do go to war, we will be thankful for this, because we will be ready to go to war. If you remember, during World War I, we declared war, and then we put the draft in place. So it took almost 9 months for our troops to be ready to go fight. When we actually enter the war in 1941, we're ready to go to war in 1941. The second effect of the Selective Service Act is it's going to start pulling us out of the Great Depression. 1 million men are going to be given jobs. Factories are going to be opening and hiring people. And that unemployment rate that had actually, it dipped down to around 16%, but now it's reclimbing again, and it's just over, it's almost 21% by 1940. That's going to start taking a major hit and start going down. And so these are the first steps that are pulling us out of the Great Depression. The New Deal, man, it got us through. It kept our head above water, but it didn't solve the problem. The Selective Service Act, going into the war, that's going to solve the problem. Not everyone in America was happy with this. We have what's called the America First Committee, and this is a group of people that, sorry about that, that their main focus is going to be to, sorry, I woke up the dogs too. Hang on just a second. Hey, stop. Are you done? Stop. Okay, sorry about that. So the America First Committee, what they're going to do is they're going to try to start a movement towards isolation. And in doing so, you're going to see some very famous people, famous Americans, go to the forefront and address this, one of those being Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is famous for being the first man to fly across the ocean. He did the 33.5-hour flight from the United States to Paris, France, and the first man to do it. He becomes a national hero, and people just absolutely fall in love with Charles Lindbergh. As the 1930s goes on, he's going to face a family tragedy that he's going to share with America, and that's going to be when his young son is kidnapped. His son will be kidnapped. You can see there, March 1st, 1932. You're going to see a nationwide search for him. Even Al Capone offered to help, get involved in the search for the Lindbergh baby. What's going to happen is, unfortunately, the baby is going to be found about, a mile or two away from the house, and the baby was killed, and the autopsy showed that the child was killed, prior to being kidnapped. I mean, basically, he was killed while he was being kidnapped. So, but America mourned with Charles Lindbergh, and then when he made his flight, and so he's our hero and everything, but now here he is speaking out against this movement towards helping the Allies in the war at this point. And you can see him, this is him speaking at an American First rally. The problem that starts to happen is, I don't know if you remember, there was a quiz question we had a couple weeks ago, and it said, it was asking about who helped Hitler rebuild his Air Force. And the answer was Charles Lindbergh. In truth, I don't know that he helped him directly build his Air Force. He might have given him some pointers. What happened is, after the kidnapping of Charles Jr., the Lindberghs moved to Europe, tried to escape the press and all the attention. And while there, he still had hero status. So he is going to meet with Hitler and tour his, aviation factories and stuff like that. And not build a friendship, but build, a relationship, with Hitler, and he just got to know him and stuff. And so a lot of people look at what Hitler's doing over in Europe, and then they see Charles Lindbergh come back to America. He also renounces, or he resigns from the Army Air Corps. And so that all that together, people start questioning, are you really arguing for peace? Or are you arguing because of your prejudice towards, for Germany and Hitler? And there's a quote that's going to chase him, that's going to haunt him. But Dr. Seuss, once again, is going to come out and show you exactly what he thinks of Lindbergh. He has Lindbergh there in this cartoon quoting, "'Tis Roosevelt, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." And you can see Lindbergh is petting the Nazi dragon and stuff. But like I said, there was one quote that Lindbergh's going to make in a speech in 1941, where he said, speaking out against America getting involved in the war, "The three most important groups who have been pressing this country towards war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration." This is going to set people on fire against Lindbergh, and there's going to be these questions: is he a Nazi? And I think even FDR referred to him once as a Nazi and really, put him down. And so in fairness, Lindbergh was not a Nazi. He was against going to war, but when we did go to war, he did try to re-enlist and join the Air Guard, but FDR wouldn't let him join. So he's going to become a civilian contractor, and he's going to be working with the fleet in the Pacific. And he actually flies 50 missions against Japan in the war in the Pacific. So, he was, I think misrepresented, but it did get pretty ugly for him here in America. By November of 1941, 1 month before we go to war, this is from the New York Times, and it shows you exactly what's on the mind of most Americans, and what are their biggest concerns and what they want the government to focus on. And the biggest thing was keeping us out of the war. Number one thing is we don't want to, go into this war. So, there we go.
I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
So there you have FDR in his campaign of 1940, promising exactly what most Americans were concerned about, the fact that he's going to keep us out of the war. Now, we also know that, like I said earlier, that FDR started, the draft and everything. So I think he had a realistic view on it. I think if he would have kept us out of the war, but we're going to obviously see that that's not going to happen. Meanwhile, over in Europe, guess who breaks another promise? Hitler is going to now turn his attention to the Soviet Union, breaking that non-aggression pact he had with Stalin, and he will invade the Soviet Union in 1941. And when they invaded, they had a lot of success. I mean, you can look at this map right here, and they got within 20 miles of Moscow, which would have toppled the Soviet Empire. But unfortunately for Hitler, like so many others, winter showed up. And when winter shows up, you can't fight in the Soviet Union. Hitler, I think, planned for winter because the idea was, as his troops moved further and further into Soviet land, and I can show you here, basically the idea was the further they get away from from Germany, the harder it is to restock their supply lines. So the plan was, as they move into the Soviet Union, they're going to restock their supplies from those, from things that, are already in Russia. So they're going to use Russia to restock their supplies. That's a great plan. And usually that worked, except for the Soviet Union. They had a plan of their own. And their plan was this, that they were going to use what's known as the scorched earth policy. And with scorched earth policy, that means we are going to destroy everything in our path. Anything that the Germans can use for their own supply and for moving forward, we are going to destroy it. And they did. They didn't just destroy food sources or anything like that. They destroyed factories, and they destroyed housing units, and everything. I mean, they literally destroyed everything in this huge swath. So when winter hits, Germany has, they have their supply line is so long, it's very difficult to get new supplies to keep their soldiers fed, to keep them healthy, to keep them armed, and to keep them warm. And so the Soviets are slowly going to start pushing back. The line you see there is as far as Germany got in their advancement into the Soviet Union. And eventually what's going to happen is the Soviet Union is going to start pushing them back. It's going to take them about 3 years, but the Soviet Union is going to make it all the way to Berlin. But once Germany attacked, the Soviet Union obviously is going to declare war, and they're going to join the Allied powers. And so this is the situation of 45. You have the Allies with with Great Britain and the Soviet Union, the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy. France still completely useless. United States still trying to stay neutral. But Hitler's feeling pretty good about himself, because you can see all the territory that the German or the Axis powers controls. Most of Europe, and northern Africa, and you can see all of that. And so in 1941, they're feeling pretty confident. This is going to be when the United States gets involved. And actually for today, this is going to be where I stop this lecture because I don't want to go any further on this.